The factory must grow, but you can't produce enough explosives to render a new species rightfully extinct without the power generation to back it up. My name is Jeezy, and today I'm going to share with you the basics of power grid management before getting into some advanced tips and technologies to keep your power grid healthier, provide you early warning that there's about to be a problem, and get everything back up and running in the event of a blackout, so that you can get back to farming alien protein. In the beginning, I'll cover basic tech and terminology, so if you're already familiar with any of the things in this video, feel free to use the chapters to jump around. Consumption is a dynamic reading of what your active machines are consuming right now. Max consumption measures your potential energy draw if all of your active and inactive machines on a grid were to draw power all at once. Production is a dynamic reading of how much power you're making at the moment, and capacity is a measurement of all of the buildings that you have on standby, ready to contribute some extra power to the grid in the event of excess load. Capacity is really only relevant for buildings like biomass burners, as once they're fueled, they'll sit idle until you need that extra power, at which point they'll kick on. Be aware that generators you flip idle, or generators that don't have enough materials, do not contribute to capacity, as neither of those things will automatically contribute when the need arises. Now that you understand these key terms, let's get into some basic power tech. There are some exceptions which we'll get into later, but for the most part, you never want your consumption to exceed your capacity. If it ever does, your power grid will trip, and you'll know when it happens. All of your connected machines will go offline. Now this isn't the end of the world. You can visit any generator or power pole attached to that grid and pull a breaker to reset the fuse. If you were connecting new machines or overclocking or doing anything which increases power draw, you can chalk it up to that, and you might just need to undo that until your power is a little bit more stable. If you weren't doing anything at the time of the trip, it could be that one of your power plants has stopped functioning or isn't running at 100% efficiency, as if your power draw is close enough to your capacity, a dip in efficiency for even a moment could cause the entire grid to come down. I see a lot of newer players balancing their power around consumption rather than max consumption. That's just asking for trouble, and let me show you why. If any production line is not running at 100% efficiency, it will occasionally sit idle. Take this tiny concrete plant, for example. It contributes about 170 megawatts of max consumption, but none of that power is currently being consumed, because both my storage and dimensional depots on the right-hand side are full. But as soon as I use any amount of concrete, those machines will all spin up at once as they attempt to fill the buffers that I've just taken the concrete from. This causes a power spike, as the grid needs to suddenly bear the load of all of those extra machines. It's unlikely that your consumption will ever reach your max consumption, but it only needs to happen for a moment for your entire grid to go down. Therefore, balancing your power capacity around max consumption will ensure that your power grid never trips, even in the event of a spike. So that will protect the power grid in an already established factory. But every new machine you add to a grid will contribute more to consumption, and the larger your grids become, the easier it is to make a mistake that trips the whole thing, and the more costly those mistakes are, especially if they end up tripping one of your power plants. You could keep a mental tally of how much those new buildings are contributing to grid load, or better yet, you could just have multiple grids. To that end, I'm going to introduce you to the single strongest power management technology, and if you take nothing else away from this video, please let it be to make good use of priority power switches. Once you toss a priority switch down, you can use it to separate your grids by connecting your global grid to the A side and connecting whatever smaller grid you like to the B side. At a very basic level, separating your grids with switches does a couple of things. It prevents them both from tripping if capacity is exceeded in one, but not the other. The priority switch specifically allows you to toggle power to sections of your factory remotely from the UI of any other priority switch. The most important functionality, though, is it gives control over what sections of your factory shut down in what order, in the event that your consumption exceeds capacity. Assigning sections of your factory to priority categories will ensure the least important areas, at priority 8, shut down first, with priority 1 being kept online at the expense of all other circuits. This is fantastic for keeping power plants up and running all the time, and I personally place my highest generation plants in priorities 1 through 4, and leave priority 5 through 8 for basic resources, advanced resources, recycling, and weaponry. Priority power switches are unfortunately locked behind some pretty advanced tech in the Caterium tree, so if you'd like to put some of these tips in place before you have access to them, you can get the basic power switches, which lack some functionality, but at the very least allow you to segment your power grids so that they don't all go down at once. But before you start segmenting your grids, you need to be familiar with the concept of dependencies. Anything that is required for the operation of a generator is known as its dependency. A coal generator, for example, depends on the miners which supply it coal, the extractors which provide it water, and any necessary pumps. The generators in a given power plant and all of its dependencies should be on the same grid whenever possible, and separated from the global grid by a priority switch. Initially, you would want to use that global grid power connection to supply energy to those dependencies until your generators got up and running. In most power generation setups, the generators will produce more power than their dependencies draw, so eventually the building will become self-sufficient, which will keep the power plant running even if that global grid power gets cut off. It's super important to have these self-sufficient plants around for a reason that I'll discuss in the Black Start section. And every plant should be self-sufficient unless it has a good reason not to, like in the case of a decentralized power plant. I have a power plant over on the west coast, using up some of that crude oil and turning it into turbo fuel. However, 2 of the raw inputs for that recipe are coal and sulfur, which I am lacking in the immediate area, so I need to ship it in from far away. This is of course problematic because the dependencies for the generators in this building are separated by distance and the global grid. A solution is to make sure those dependencies, no matter how far away they are on their own priority power grids, and that those grids are aligned with the priority level of the thing that they supply. But even perfect use of priority switches will not stop your power from going down due to a disconnect. So this is where I want to talk about implementing redundancies. The basic idea of a redundancy is that there are multiple paths for the power to take, so that if one of them is cut, it can continue along the other. For example, having both a transmission line and a train line carrying your global grid power around the map. This is especially helpful if you need to temporarily disconnect a train line, like for the purpose of adding a new intersection, as power will continue flowing along your transmission lines while you work. Now, of course, that only works if one of those things always stays connected, and I don't know about you all, but I'm very easily distracted. If you want to go one layer deeper, you can start looking into power storage. There are a few ways to go about power storage. The first is obvious, it's batteries. They intake power when there's a surplus, and they output power when there's an extra need on the grid. You can see the overall charge of all connected grids by clicking this arrow here. If they're filling, it will tell you how long until they reach maximum, and if they're draining, it will tell you how long you have until you run out of juice. A notification will be given to you if one of your batteries does begin to drain, and it's a great early warning that you've exceeded your capacity, and you're on a timer to fix the problem or scale back your consumption. They measure their power availability in megawatt hours. It's how much power a building consuming a single megawatt would use in an hour's time. Therefore, a single battery with a capacity of 100 megawatt hours could power a factory requiring 100 megawatts of stable usage for 1 hour. One thing to keep in mind when you're using both power storage and priority switches is that batteries can only redistribute power to a grid that they are connected to. That sounds obvious, but if your batteries are on a low priority grid that ends up getting disconnected, the rest of your grids will lose access to that stored energy. Which is why I like to keep the majority of my power storage on a single high priority grid, as if that grid were to get disconnected, I would have larger problems to deal with. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea to have batteries spread across your many grids. In fact, having a few batteries connected to each of your priority grids can help keep them running in the case of a temporary disconnect, and is especially helpful in the case of those satellite dependencies that I mentioned earlier. And with the goal in mind of making it much faster to set those things up on their own grids with batteries, I created a Substation Blueprint that has a priority power switch, a light control panel if that matters to you, and a capacity of 200 megawatt hours in these 2 batteries here. That's enough power to keep a fully overclocked Mark II miner alive for just under 4 hours. If you want it, link to the blueprint will be in the description. And then you have potential energy, or energy stored in the form of items. The larger an item buffer you have at a power plant, the more potential downtime you can effectively mitigate, and the easier it is to keep 100% uptime when dealing with variable throughput transport like trains, as it can take some time for multiple long-distance train routes to average out. But let's say you've followed all of these tips and somehow the worst still came to pass. Your power grid has gone completely down, and you have no other option but to black start, which is the process of bringing your grid back online from scratch. In some scenarios, you may be able to just reload an older save where your power grid has yet to trip. However, as your factories and power plants become more complex, an incident leading to an eventual and total power failure may have happened so long ago, and so quietly, that you didn't realize it until it was too late, and kept doing important work in the meantime. The black start process can be broken down into a few stages. First off, you'll want to head to a priority power switch and make sure that everything is disconnected. If one of your grids has tripped, you need to identify which one it is so you can make sure not to attach any of your other grids to it, as they'll just end up tripping too. One thing to note is a grid which requires power will trip if fed insufficient power, but won't trip if you feed it nothing. So if you're struggling to get a grid to untrip itself, make sure you don't have any geothermal or other generators attempting to supply insufficient power. Once you've pulled the breaker on every tripped grid, you can begin looking at those self-sufficient power plants that I mentioned earlier. Your first self-sufficient power plant should have enough power to supply a few things. First off, it needs enough power to run itself, and it needs to supply enough power to the global grid to run any trains and unincorporated buildings. If you've done a good job at segmenting every section of your factory with priority switches, your total global grid draw should be pretty low. You can then start flipping on any lower generation self-sufficient plants that you may have, and any geothermal generators. Once all of your self-sufficient plants are online, you can begin toggling power to the dependencies of larger power plants, so they can start being supplied with resources. If you are restarting a larger power plant which has gone dry during your grid downtime, you may need to restart it in stages. The best way to prepare to do this is just to build the power plant in stages, so that a fraction of power consumption and power production is on its own closed circuit. Think of it like having a mini power plant in your power plant, and then just do that as many times as you need. If, however, you haven't done that already, you might need to go in and manually toggle standby on all of the machines in the building before connecting power to it, slowly toggling one machine at a time until the building has enough power generation to kickstart itself. I wouldn't recommend doing it this way unless you have truly no other option. It's incredibly annoying. Once you know your power generation is stable, you can begin toggling your production sectors as well. Hopefully, as you were going through this process, you figured out what caused the problem in the first place, and you can begin taking steps to rectify it. Hey everybody, thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please leave it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it around. And consider becoming a member of the channel if you'd like to show your support for my continued content creation. Also, you can come hang out over on Twitch if you'd like to chat Satisfactory, or just see what I've been up to. Lately, I've been working on a Mark II version of my modular road system that I released some time ago. And one final thing, I put a poll up on the channel regarding the next few videos that I'm going to be putting out, as I have a lot of cool ideas, and I can't really decide. So if you have an extra second and have an opinion on what kind of content you'd like to see next on the channel, please let me know which of those is most interesting to you. But regardless of how you choose to spend the rest of your day, I hope that it's an efficient one. And as always, I'm Jeezy, and I'll see you in the next one.